The tremor starts in her hands before she even clocks in. Megan O'Brien pushes through the staff entrance at Sacred Heart Hospital in Jacksonville at 11:08 p.m., and her fingers betray her the moment the automatic doors exhale cold air. 3 years. That's how long she's been working night shift ICU in these sterile corridors, invisible in navy scrubs, her brown hair cinched in the same tight bun she's worn since the extraction. 3 years of being just another nurse. The tremor isn't from fear. It's from restraint. She presses her palms flat against her thighs as she walks toward the locker room. The hospital smells like antiseptic layered over floor wax, that chemical signature that never quite covers what lies underneath: blood, sickness, the particular loneliness of people dying in rows. Her locker is third from the left, combination 14-27-33, and she opens it without looking up. Inside her scrubs, folded in thirds. Her ID badge clipped to the lanyard. And at the back, pressed against the cold metal, a small object wrapped in black electrical tape. She doesn't touch it. Not yet. The controlled breathing begins before she finishes changing. 4 counts in through the nose. 7 counts held. 8 counts out through the mouth. Her body knows this rhythm better than her lungs do. The tremor in her hand stops. Exactly 3 seconds. That's how long it takes her nervous system to remember that the war is over, that Helmand Province is 7,000 miles away, that she chose to survive. She has no choice now but to keep surviving, quietly, visibly, without a single person in this hospital understanding why a 34-year-old ICU nurse moves the way she does, scans exits in every room, and flinches at helicopter sounds in the distance. Megan clips her badge to her scrubs. The magnetic stripe catches the fluorescent light, the kind of light that hums at precisely 60 Hz, a frequency that makes her molars ache if she listens long enough. She doesn't listen anymore. She moves through Sacred Heart the same way she moved through forward operating bases, with economy of motion, no wasted steps, no eye contact and less required. The night shift ICU is her kingdom only because no one better wanted it. Dr. Richard Ashford runs the floor like a man who's never been told no. 6'2", salt and pepper hair styled with the precision of someone who understands that appearance is authority, and a presence that makes the air pressure change when he enters a room. He's been the attending physician here for 17 years. Long enough to make sure everyone on his team understands they exist at his discretion. Megan has corrected exactly 1 medication error in his presence. It was 14 months ago. A surgical resident was setting up a pre-op patient for a procedure, and Ashford had written an order for 5 mg of lorazepam when the patient's renal function would have processed maximum 2 mg safely. She'd pointed to the lab values on his chart. Said it quietly. In front of a third-year resident who was watching how authority works. Ashford had smiled like a predator. From that moment forward, he's been teaching her a specific lesson: visible competence is a threat to invisible power, and invisible power always wins. The ICU fills as the evening team transitions to nights. Nurses move between rooms with practiced efficiency, checking monitors, adjusting drips, documenting vital signs in the electronic system that hums and blinks with its own mechanical patience. Megan takes report at 12:15 a.m. from Sarah Chen, the day shift charge nurse who avoids meeting her eyes. Nobody's talking directly to Sarah, either, not since Ashford restructured the schedule last month and moved her allies to different shifts, one by one, the way you remove support beams from a structure that's about to collapse. The isolation is deliberate. The isolation is part of the punishment. 6 beds under her watch tonight. A post-MI patient in room 407 with new arrhythmias. A septic elderly male in 409 who's been unresponsive for 18 hours. A young trauma case in 411 recovering from a femur fracture surgery. The beds are full with the specific weight of human suffering that night shift carries, the time when families go home, when machines do the talking, when the only witnesses to survival are the nurses who know better than to expect gratitude. At 1:34 a.m., the trauma bay alert comes through the intercom. Not a code yet. Just a warning. The dispatcher's voice is flat, professional: trauma alert, 34 minutes out. Highway collision, multi-vehicle, one patient critical, ETA 208. Megan finishes checking before en route for 09 and walks toward trauma. That's when she hears the rotor wash. The helicopter's already closer than the dispatch said. She can feel it in her bones before her brain catches up, that specific vibration that means someone's bleeding faster than they're thinking, someone's time is already being measured in minutes instead of hours. She's felt this rhythm before. She knows exactly what it means. The life flight helicopter lands on the roof access 16 stories up, and the trauma team assembles like a practiced choreography. The attending emergency physician, 2 surgical residents, respiratory therapist, lab tech, nursing staff in positions they've rehearsed 100 times. Ashford arrives at 2:07 p.m. wearing his white coat like armor. He positions himself at the head of the bed because that's where power sits in a trauma resuscitation. The patient comes through the doors on a stretcher, and there's nothing visible except damage. Male, appears mid-30s, unconscious, left side crushed against a semi-truck that hit him doing 62 miles per hour on I-95. His clothes are shredded. His left leg is already tagged for OR, femur fracture, compound, bone exposed, tissue loss that will require a plastic surgeon before it requires a vascular surgeon. But those are problems for later. Right now the problem is the expanding hematoma on his left side, the way his breathing is shallow even with supplemental oxygen, the growing darkness of blood pooling under ribs that might already be fractured. Megan pulls on fresh gloves and steps into the controlled chaos. Her hands move where they're needed, cutting away the remaining clothes, exposing the abdomen for assessment, starting the process of making an unconscious man's body readable to the physicians who will decide whether he lives. His boots are coming off because boots hide things, because trauma assessment means stripping away everything down to skin and damage. She's cutting away the left boot when her fingers brush something that shouldn't be there. The broken chain catches under the leather. She pulls it free without thinking, muscle memory older than her nursing license, older than her civilian identity. The dog tag is cold against her palm. She reads it without meaning to read it, 75th Ranger Regiment, Helmand Province, and a soldier's name that means nothing to her because soldiers in Helmand Province aren't supposed to be unconscious in trauma bays in Jacksonville, Florida. Her chest tightens. The sensation arrives with the force of a door slamming shut, buried memory, controlled breathing, the very specific pain that comes from recognizing a world she'd promised her handlers she would never touch again. The dog tag is heavy in her hand for a reason that has nothing to do with physics. Her fingers still. Her breathing deepens. The room remains perfectly professional around her, but she's no longer entirely in it. Part of her is somewhere else. Somewhere with sand and impact and the screaming of rotors at 200 feet altitude. Dr. Ashford sees the hesitation. His eyes track her hand. He watches her fingers freeze for half a heartbeat, watches her gaze drop to the dog tag she's still holding. And in that single moment of vulnerability, something shifts in his expression. It's not sympathy. It's something much worse. It's recognition of weakness. It's opportunity. She forces herself to breathe. 4 counts in. 7 counts held. 8 counts out. Her hand releases the dog tag onto the tray beside the patient's abdomen, and her tremor stops. 3 seconds. That's how long it takes muscle memory to override emotion, for training to reassert dominance over human feeling. She steps back into position as if nothing happened. But Ashford is still watching. The fluorescent lights above the ICU hummed their familiar mechanical drone as Megan adjusted the foredrip on the John Doe's arm, her movements precise and economical. 6 months. That's how long Dr. Ashford had been building his case against her, brick by brick, ever since she'd quietly corrected his lorazepam dosage in front of a surgical resident. 5 milligrams instead of the 0.5 he'd ordered, a decimal point that would have stopped a heart. She'd whispered the correction, barely audible, but he'd heard. More importantly, the resident had heard. The hierarchy had cracked, just slightly, and Ashford had never forgotten the sound. Now he watched her from the nursing station with the patience of a predator. She could feel his eyes on her back like weight pressing against her spine. The dog tag was still in her pocket, the chain broken, the metal warm against her ribs. She'd hidden it there after the initial intake, unable to leave it with his belongings in the property locker, unable to let it go. A 75th Ranger Regiment soldier. Helmand Province. The inscriptions were worn, handled thousands of times by hands that had survived what most people couldn't imagine. Her hands had held similar tags. She'd worn one herself, once, in another life. During morning rounds, Ashford positioned himself at the patient's bedside with 6 residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. Megan stood at the forestand, checking flow rates, her scrubs hanging loose on a frame that had been built for different purposes. Nurse O'Brien, Ashford's voice carried across 6 beds, loud enough for everyone to hear. You've been hovering over this patient for 4 hours. Is there something you'd like to share with the team? Megan looked up from the monitor. Her voice came out measured, professional. Ensuring proper care, doctor. Or perhaps you're emotionally compromised. He turned to the residents with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I noticed you examining his personal effects. The dog tag. Do you have a thing for soldiers, Nurse Florence? The residents shifted uncomfortably. One looked at the floor. Another suddenly became very interested in their tablet. Ashford had called her by the wrong name on purpose, a small cruelty, a public diminishment. She wasn't Megan O'Brien. In his mouth, she was just a generic nurse, interchangeable, forgettable. A utility with emotions instead of competence. Megan took one measured breath through her nose. She could feel heat crawling up her neck like fire spreading through dry brush. For 18 years she'd been trained to compartmentalize, to separate the thinking part of her mind from the feeling part, to let neither interfere with the mission. But that training hadn't prepared her for this. It had prepared her for war, not for the slow, methodical destruction of her professional reputation by a man in a $600 suit who was afraid of a nurse who'd caught him making a mistake. A single tear escaped her left eye. It wasn't the tear of someone breaking. It was the tear of someone holding back, of restraint so tight it had to overflow somewhere. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. She wiped it with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact and said, I've seen worse men than you hide behind credentials, doctor. The room went dead silent. The ventilator beside the bed wheezed its mechanical rhythm into the vacuum. Ashford's jaw tightened, a muscle working under his skin like something trying to escape. His face flushed. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, nobody moved. Then he turned away from the patient's bedside and walked toward the unit board in the hallway, his footsteps sharp against the tile floor. The residents followed like uncertain ducklings, nobody speaking. Megan returned to her chart, her hand steady. She documented the patient's vitals with surgical precision, oxygen saturation 96%, heart rate 68 and regular, blood pressure 142/88. Her handwriting didn't shake. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the coiled muscle of someone trained to fight, forced to stand still. Ashford was already writing on the unit board in red marker when she passed the nursing station. She could see her name from 15 feet away. O'Brien. Written warning. Emotional attachment to patient. Professionalism review pending. He'd made it large enough for anyone walking past to read. A public marking, a scarlet letter in dry erase ink. By lunchtime, Megan entered the break room carrying a sandwich she'd made at home. 5 nurses were sitting at the table. One looked up, recognized her, and suddenly remembered she needed to check on a patient in pediatrics. Another glanced at her phone and said, "Oh, I have to call the lab." A third stood and said, "I promised to cover Jackson Station." Within 90 seconds, the room was empty except for Megan and the fluorescent hum overhead. She sat at the table and stared at her untouched sandwich, feeling the isolation settle around her like cold water. This was institutional warfare. This was how they did it, not with confrontation, but with absence. Not with arguments, but with the slow erasure of allies. That afternoon, the ranger's sister arrived. Her name was Sarah Chen, mid-40s, carrying anxiety like luggage. She had a 10-year-old daughter with her, a girl with dark eyes that kept darting around the ICU as if trying to understand the machinery keeping her uncle alive. Megan was checking the cardiac monitor when they entered the room, adjusting the leads across the patient's chest with practiced efficiency. The sister introduced herself, voice tight with worry. "I'm his only family here. He doesn't have kids." "I'm it." Megan nodded. "He's stable. Vitals are strong. We're monitoring him closely." That's when Ashford appeared in the doorway with his tablet, moving like he owned the space. "Mrs. Chen, I'm Dr. Ashford, the attending physician. I wanted to assure you your brother is receiving excellent care." He positioned himself between Megan and the family, blocking her from view. "That said, I do need to address some concerns about the nursing staff assigned to him." Megan kept her eyes on the monitor. The lead wire was properly secured. The waveform displayed normal sinus rhythm. Everything was fine. Everything was working. Nothing had changed except the narrative Ashford was about to construct. "Concerns?" The sister's voice climbed higher. The daughter grabbed her mother's hand. "Nurse O'Brien has been displaying some instability." Ashford's tone was sympathetic, almost concerned, as if he regretted having to share this burden. "Emotional reactions. Unprofessional focus on specific patients." He paused, letting the implication settle. "We're monitoring the situation, but I want you to know we take patient safety seriously. If you notice anything unusual in her behavior, please alert me directly." The 10-year-old was staring at Megan now with wide eyes. Megan finished documenting the vitals and closed the chart. "Your brother's oxygen saturation is 96%. Heart rate steady at 68. Blood pressure is stable." Her voice was level, informational, as if Ashford's words had never landed. "I'll continue monitoring throughout the shift." She walked out with the kind of dignity that comes from having learned, long ago, that the only power you have over someone else's words is the choice not to flinch. The dog tag was still warm against her ribs. She didn't touch it. She didn't acknowledge its presence. But she felt it there, a reminder of what she'd been, of hands that could do things these hands no longer did. By the next shift rotation, Ashford had consolidated his power like a general moving chess pieces across a board. Megan's two closest allies, nurses who'd worked with her for 2 years, who'd covered her back, who'd kept the isolation from becoming complete, were reassigned. One went to pediatrics. The other to outpatient surgery. The new night schedule went up on the unit board with Megan's name isolated in the ICU with only a recent graduate named Tyler, fresh out of nursing school, terrified of contradicting doctors. Ashford personally took over as attending for the John Doe, restricting Megan's access to treatment decisions. She could provide basic care only. No medication changes. No procedure approvals. Just the nurse who emptied bedpans and checked monitors while someone else made the decisions. During a mandatory staff meeting, he announced a care quality review. His voice was measured, professional, the voice of a man protecting the institution. "We're examining patterns in patient care interactions over the past 6 months. This is standard procedure. Nothing to be concerned about." He read from a list. Megan's name came first. The investigation would examine her patient interactions, looking for concerning attachment or judgment lapses. He was building a file. Making phone calls to board members about liability concerns. Planting seeds about a nurse who might be a lawsuit waiting to happen. Megan knew this playbook. She'd seen it in different forms on different battlefields. Institutional warfare. Death by 1,000 policy violations. An enemy who moved through paperwork instead of bullets, who killed careers with forms instead of fire. But she'd survived worse than this. That's what made it unbearable. She had survived worse, and she couldn't fight back. The one promise that kept her alive was the promise to stay hidden, and fighting back meant surfacing, meant breaking the covenant with her handlers, meant erasing the new identity they'd given her. That night, she drove to Jacksonville Memorial Gardens. The graveyard was quiet at 11 p.m., the grounds empty except for the rain that had started falling an hour before. David O'Brien's plot was in the east section, a small stone beneath a live oak. Beloved husband. The date spanned only 28 years. They'd known they wouldn't get more time than that when they married. That was the understanding with operatives who loved operatives. You took what you could get, and you didn't ask for more. She kneeled in the mud, her uniform scrub soaking through at the knees. The rain was cold, the kind of rain that felt like it was washing something away. I promised I'd stay hidden, she whispered. I promised them I'd never surface. Never draw attention. Her voice cracked slightly, the only break in her composure happening in a place where no one could witness it. But hiding turned me into a ghost, David. I can't even fight back without erasing myself. Ashford is going to destroy me, and I can't do anything without breaking the one promise that keeps me alive. She stayed there for an hour, rain soaking through her jacket, her hands pressed against the wet earth. She didn't cry. She didn't break. She kneeled in the mud and whispered apologies to a man who couldn't answer, because that's what was left. That's what hiding had become, talking to graves, accepting humiliation in silence, watching someone else decide her fate because surfacing meant death. Not her death. Worse. It meant the death of everyone she'd promised to protect. Then her phone buzzed. An emergency alert from Sacred Heart. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. The John Doe was crashing. The rain hadn't stopped when Megan pushed through the employee entrance at Sacred Heart, her scrub still damp along the collar, her hands still cold from pressing them against David's gravestone 30 minutes ago. The parking lot had been empty except for the storm and her own car, and she'd sat there for 5 minutes after leaving the cemetery, water streaming down the windshield, before the hospital alert came through on her phone, Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. The John Doe was crashing. She'd driven back in silence, no music, just the sound of wipers and her own breathing, steady and controlled, the way it had been in Helmand when the medevac was 10 minutes out and a sergeant's leg was hemorrhaging faster than fluids could replace it. The ER was controlled chaos when she arrived, the kind of organized urgency that meant the worst had already passed through triage. She changed into fresh scrubs in the locker room, her fingers moving on muscle memory, belt off, boots touching the floor, new uniform on, badge clipped precisely to her left pocket. The combat tab was still in there, tucked against the fabric where it had lived for 6 years, a piece of silver smaller than a postage stamp but heavier than anything else she carried. She let her palm rest against it for 3 seconds. Just 3. Then she was moving through the corridors toward radiology, past the nursing station where 2 residents were arguing about CT protocols. The John Doe was already prepped on the scanning table when she entered the radiology suite, his body still bruised from the highway impact, ribs wrapped tight, for lines running clean. He was sedated, propofol drip keeping him unconscious, a ventilator managing his breathing, numbers scrolling across the monitors in a rhythm Megan's hands knew by instinct. The tech, a young woman named Sarah with nervous fingers, was positioning the scanner's gantry. Routine CT, Sarah said quietly, not making eye contact with Megan. Dr. Ashford wants to check for internal bleeding progression before surgery. He's on his way down. Megan nodded, moving to the left side of the gurney where the vital sign monitors clustered like a small city of glass and plastic. Oxygen saturation 96%. Heart rate 104. Blood pressure 130/82. All reasonable. All stable. She'd worked ICU long enough to read the numbers like sentences, and these sentences said the Ranger had made it through the first crisis, at least. But Megan had also worked in Helmand Province long enough to know that injuries didn't announce themselves on schedule. They waited. They festered. They ambushed you when you thought the patient was safe. Ashford appeared in the doorway 7 minutes later, his white coat immaculate, his expression somewhere between irritated and calculating. He didn't look at Megan. He looked at the monitors, then at the patient, then at the scanning equipment with the attitude of a man inspecting a car he was about to buy. "Begin the scan," he ordered, and Sarah nodded, retreating to the control room. The table slid forward with a pneumatic whisper. The machine hummed to life, a sound like an enormous bee trapped inside a metal box, and the imaging began, layers of the Ranger's chest appearing on the screens in real time, grey and white cross-sections showing ribs and lungs and the steady architecture of a human body that had survived 3 decades and a highway impact. Megan watched the monitors. Not Ashford. not the patient. The monitors, where the real story was being written in oxygen saturation and heart rhythm and blood pressure that was supposed to stay steady. She'd learned that trick in her second tour: never watch the person, watch the machines. The machines don't lie. The machines don't have pride. The machines just speak in numbers, and if you listen, they'll tell you everything you need to know about 5 minutes from now. 98%. 102 beats per minute. 131/84. All still good. Scan continuing. The gantry rotated, capturing another slice, and Megan could see the patient's lungs in cross-section, filled with air, pink and symmetrical, and exactly what lungs were supposed to look like when they were doing their job. But something in her chest, some mechanism older than words, carved into her nervous system in a field hospital outside Kandahar, suddenly tightened. The left lung looked different on the next image. Slightly compressed. Just slightly. Barely enough to register as abnormal to someone who wasn't looking for it. Megan's hand moved to the call button without permission from her conscious mind. It was already moving, already reaching, when Sarah's voice crackled from the control room. "Doctor, his SAT's dropping." 94%. 89. 85. The numbers fell like dominoes. The heart rate climbed, 115, 125, 138, a clock ticking backward toward cardiac arrest. Ashford turned toward the monitors, his expression flickering between confusion and the first edge of panic. "Get him out of the machine," he said, and it wasn't an order. It was a request. It was a man watching something he didn't understand happen to a patient under his care, and his voice had lost its certainty. Sarah pulled the table out. The patient's chest wasn't rising evenly anymore. Megan could see it now, the way the right side moved with the ventilator's rhythm while the left side barely moved at all, as if something inside was pushing back against the inflation, resisting, building pressure like a system about to fail. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the pleural space, compressing the lung, increasing pressure with every breath the ventilator pushed in, pushing the heart aside, squeezing the great vessels, building toward a cardiac arrest that would happen in minutes if nothing changed. The patient's lips were turning blue, not the dark blue of cyanosis but the pale gray blue of someone whose oxygen-carrying capacity was being strangled by physics. "Increase oxygen flow," Ashford said, and there was a tremor in his voice now, the small fracture of a man who had given an order that wouldn't fix what was broken. "Get anesthesia down here. We need to manage the airway." But managing the airway wouldn't fix a pneumothorax. Managing the airway would only delay the inevitable by 30 seconds. What the ranger needed was pressure release. What he needed was a needle between his ribs, a catheter in the pleural space, the hiss of 300 milliliters of trapped air escaping and the lung re-expanding and the heart returning to its proper position in the chest. What he needed was someone who had done this before. Megan walked to the crash cart without speaking. Her hands were steady, not the steadiness of someone who was calm, but the steadiness of someone whose hands had learned long ago that trembling was a luxury for people who had time. She found the 14-gauge angiocath needle in the sterile tray, the silver catching the light, and she found the scalpel in its paper wrapper, and she turned back toward the patient on the table. "Nurse O'Brien, step back," Ashford said, and his voice had recovered its edge, the edge of authority attempting to reassert itself in a moment when authority had stopped mattering. But Megan was already moving, already counting ribs with her fingers, already feeling for the second intercostal space on the patient's right side, the space between ribs 2 and 3 where the air was waiting to be released. She made the incision with the scalpel, not deep, just through skin and fascia, a quarter-inch opening, and inserted the catheter with the muscle memory of someone who had done this in a sandstorm with mortar fire overhead and a sergeant screaming and blood everywhere and nothing but her hands and her knowledge and the certainty that if she didn't do this in the next 10 seconds, the patient would die. The hiss was immediate. Not loud, just a soft release of pressure, like letting air out of a tire, like exhaling after holding your breath too long. The catheter was in place. The air was escaping. 86% oxygen saturation. 91. 95. The numbers climbed like a plane gaining altitude, and the patient's color returned, the gray-blue fading, the lips pinking up, the chest now rising evenly on both sides with the ventilator's rhythm symmetrical and correct and alive. 102 seconds. That was all it took. 102 seconds and a decision and hands that remembered. Ashford stared at her. His face went through a series of expressions like a man watching someone move in fast-forward, shock, confusion, then a slowness that felt almost like calculation, a rewiring of something in his expression that made Megan's hands finally go cold. "You just performed an unauthorized invasive procedure without physician approval," he said quietly. "That's grounds for immediate termination and possible criminal charges." He pulled out his phone with the careful precision of a man who had decided something, and the dial tone was audible in the silence. "Security. I need you in radiology now." But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the smile that crossed his face as he lowered the phone, the smile of a man who had just realized that the one thing Megan could never do was defend herself without revealing exactly what she'd been trained to hide. The catheter needle was ice-cold against her fingertips. Megan's hands moved on their own. 14 years of muscle memory didn't need her brain's permission anymore. She found the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, and drove the needle through skin and muscle and pleura in one fluid motion. The hiss of air escaping sounded like a pressure relief valve on a submarine, sudden and absolute. The monitors responded instantly. Oxygen saturation climbing. 88, 92, 96, sinus rhythm restored. Torres's lips shifted from purple-blue back to human pink. She'd done this in a sandstorm in Helmand Province with mortar fire overhead and the smell of copper and diesel in her lungs. She'd done it in the dark with only a red lens flashlight and a man screaming below her. She'd done it enough times that her hands remembered the angle even when her mind tried to forget. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm as she secured the catheter with practice tape. Around her, the code team was moving again, people calling numbers, residents shoving crash cart supplies back into drawers. Dr. Ashford stood motionless at the monitors, watching the green lines dance across the screen. His expression was unreadable. That was the moment Megan made her mistake. She glanced at him. Just for a second. Long enough for him to see something in her eyes that confirmed what he'd suspected, that she wasn't a nurse who'd gotten lucky. That she was something else entirely. He smiled. Within the hour, 2 federal agents and a hospital administrator arrived at her door with a suspension notice and orders to accompany them to the administrative office. The hallway seemed to narrow as she walked, every staff member suddenly finding reasons to look away. The break room door, where yesterday nurses had scattered like startled birds when she entered, remained closed, curtains drawn. Pain was information. This silence told her everything. The conference room on the 3rd floor smelled of dark coffee and mahogany polish. 3 board members sat behind an oak table that cost more than Megan's annual salary. Ashford stood at the head, a presentation remote in his hand, and he looked like a man who'd just been handed a loaded weapon. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carefully modulated between concern and disappointment, "what I'm about to present is a breach of fundamental protocol that puts Sacred Heart's accreditation and liability insurance at serious risk." He clicked through slides. Documentation of her written warning. Witness statements from staff about her unusual emotional investment in patient Torres. Psychiatric evaluation forms he'd requested, forms that hadn't been completed yet but whose requests alone looked damning on the administrative record. Her isolation during breaks. Her tendency to work late and linger in patient rooms. The pattern of a nurse crossing professional boundaries. Then, Ashford continued, at approximately 18:47 hours today, she performed a needle decompression, a chest cavity procedure, without physician authorization. She grabbed a scalpel from the crash cart and intervened in a medical emergency that was being managed by the attending physician. One board member, an older man with silver glasses, straightened. She performed a thoracotomy. A needle decompression, technically, Ashford corrected, his tone suggesting the distinction was negligible. But yes. Without orders. Without permission. Without any documentation of training or authorization. He paused, letting that sink in. Fortunately, the patient survived. But what if he hadn't? What if her emotional attachment to this patient, which we've documented from day one, had clouded her judgment? The oldest board member, a retired cardiac surgeon named Whitmore, leaned forward. What was the clinical indication? Tension pneumothorax, Ashford said. The patient was deteriorating. I was preparing to call for a chest tube placement and transfer to the OR. How quickly? Ashford's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I had assessed the situation and determined the appropriate response. Whitmore didn't blink. How quickly, Dr. Ashford? Within minutes, Ashford said, recovering. The patient is stable now. But the precedent is the issue. If we allow nursing staff to override physician judgment during code situations, we create chaos. Liability nightmares. JCAHO violations. He was good. Megan had to give him that. He'd woven the truth into something that looked rotten from every angle. Torres had survived. She'd saved his life. And somehow that was being reframed as the evidence of her instability. Major O'Brien. Whitmore said, and Megan's breath caught. He'd used her rank. The word hung in the air like a blade. Ashford's head snapped toward her, confused. Whitmore was studying something on his phone. That's an unusual first name. It's how I'm listed in hospital records, Megan said carefully. Legal name is Margaret. I go by Megan. I see. Whitmore didn't look up. And your background in emergency medicine, you mentioned experience with trauma cases. 12 years, Megan said. Each word clipped short. Various settings. Including field medicine. The room went still. Ashford's face had gone pale. He understood exactly what was happening now, that he'd pushed a button he didn't know was connected to something far larger than him. Yes, Megan said. Whitmore nodded slowly. Dr. Ashford, I appreciate your concern for patient safety. However, based on what I'm seeing here, I believe the appropriate response is a brief administrative review rather than immediate suspension pending investigation. He set his phone down deliberately. I'd like to speak with you and Nurse O'Brien separately. Gentlemen, if you could excuse us. The other two board members exchanged confused glances but stood and filed out. When the door closed, Whitmore turned to Ashford. Your patient is stable, Whitmore said quietly. Your staff member performed an appropriate emergency intervention. You're now attempting to use paperwork to punish her for saving his life. He paused. That's a pattern I've seen before, Dr. Ashford. Usually it ends with someone reviewing your own medical decisions very carefully. Ashford's voice came out thin. With respect, sir, protocol will be suspended, Whitmore interrupted, while we conduct a full peer review of your decision-making in the Torres case. You'll be assigned to administrative duties for the next 30 days. No patient contact. No attending privileges in the ER. He turned to Megan. You're not suspended. But I need to ask you directly, is there anything in your background you believe this hospital should know? Megan didn't hesitate. The lie was already prepared, burnished smooth from 16 years of use. No, sir. Just nursing. Just nursing, Whitmore repeated. He knew. He absolutely knew. And he was giving her an exit. A way out that didn't require her to confirm anything. Very well. You'll return to your regular schedule tomorrow. We'll process a formal reprimand for the unauthorized procedure. It goes in your file but carries no other penalty. Standard institutional protection. He opened a folder. However, I do need you to sign this acknowledgement that you understand hospital protocols regarding emergency procedures. She signed. Her hand steady. No tremor. No hesitation. The ghost of who she used to be didn't shake. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came after. Ashford's voice caught her in the hallway outside the conference room. Quiet. Almost friendly. You know what's going to happen now, don't you? Megan stopped walking. You saved him, Ashford continued, stepping closer. And now his unit is going to know about him. His family is going to know he was hurt. And someone, somewhere, is going to start asking questions about who treated him. About why a nurse named Megan O'Brien has survival skills a combat surgeon would be jealous of. He was right. She could feel it already, the machinery moving in the background, notifications being sent to databases she'd been erased from, flags being raised in systems she thought had forgotten her name. My suspension, Ashford said, gets overturned in a week. This hospital doesn't fire doctors. But you? He smiled that smile again, the smile of a man watching dominoes fall in a pattern he'd already calculated. You can't fight back without revealing exactly what you've been hiding. Can you, Major? He walked past her before she could respond, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with the confidence of a man who'd just realized he'd already won. Megan drove home in silence. Her hands finally shaking on the steering wheel, but not from fear. From rage. From the understanding that Ashford was right. She couldn't defend herself. Not without surfacing. Not without confirming everything the government had spent 16 years denying. She parked in her driveway and sat in the dark for 45 minutes, watching rain hammer the windshield like applause no one was asking for. What she didn't know was that the machinery Ashford had sensed was already far deeper than even he'd suspected. When hospital HR ran the mandatory background check for her suspension proceedings, the box-checking exercise that would eventually clear her, the system flagged something unusual. The security clearance buried in databases they weren't supposed to access. The Department of Defense indicator that should have been scrubbed clean but wasn't. Not entirely. By 2 a.m., that flag reached a desk at Fort Bragg. By 3 a.m., it reached a name that recognized another name. Torres was stable. Improving. His sister sat beside his bed, holding his good hand, and told him stories about his niece's soccer team and his mother's garden. Standard recovery. Standard hope. But at 3:22 a.m., a transfer order came through. Federal facility. Medical van arriving at 8 a.m. sharp. Not a request. A command. Exactly 5 hours after Megan had been escorted out of Sacred Heart Hospital, military transport would arrive to move him. But something else was arriving first. The military transport pulled into Sacred Heart's loading dock at exactly 5 hours and 17 minutes after Megan's suspension was finalized. A black Suburban with government plates, 2 soldiers in dress uniforms, insignia identifying them as 75th Ranger Regiment liaison officers. They moved with the quiet efficiency of men who'd done this 100 times, collecting assets, securing operational integrity, moving on. The Ranger was already prepped for transport, conscious now, his daughter sitting beside his bed with her small hand wrapped around his IV-free fingers. He tried to smile at Megan as they wheeled the bed toward the elevator, but she wasn't in the room. She'd been escorted from the unit an hour earlier by security, her badge deactivated, her locker sealed pending investigation. That night, rain hammered Jacksonville like artillery, and Megan stood at the gate of Riverside Memorial Gardens with mud seeping into her shoes. David's headstone was weathered granite, his name and 2 dates, 1989 to 2019, carved in letters she'd traced 10,000 times. A fellow operative. Her partner in the field. Dead in the same mission that had made her a ghost. She pressed her palm against the cold stone and let the rain soak through her jacket, let it run down her face indistinguishable from tears, and spoke to the granite like it could hear her. I tried to stay invisible like they asked. Kept my head down. Followed protocol. But it turns out protocol doesn't protect you from people like him. It just gives them a weapon. Her voice broke, not the controlled measured breaks of her military years, but something rawer. I failed you twice, David. Once in Helmand. And again by becoming someone so small that I couldn't even fight back without erasing myself completely. The cemetery was empty except for the rain. No witnesses. No one watching her composure crack. Just a woman in wet scrubs mourning everything she'd surrendered to stay alive. She was standing in her kitchen at 2:41 a.m., coffee gone cold, when her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered because after everything, what was the worst that could happen? A woman's voice, crisp and federal. Is this Megan O'Brien? Not a request. Not a greeting. An identification. This is Sarah Chen, Special Agent, FBI Domestic Security Division. We need to discuss some anomalies that appeared in your personnel background check. The call lasted 18 minutes. By the end of it, Megan understood that the security clearance buried deep in her file, the one she'd thought was erased, had triggered every alarm when Sacred Heart's HR department tried to process her suspension. Classified data couldn't be suspended. Classified personnel didn't go through normal termination procedures. And when federal systems flagged a hidden military security clearance embedded in civilian hospital databases, people with badges and credentials started asking very specific questions. Special Agent Chen said they'd be arriving at her residence in 3 hours with a warrant to secure her property. They didn't use the word property. They said the MacGuffin object, and Megan understood immediately that somewhere in the federal machinery, her dog tag on its broken chain had been flagged as evidentiary material. They came at dawn. Not agents, contractors, actually, moving with the purposeful silence of people who'd cleared buildings before. They opened her locker at Sacred Heart with a court order that made the hospital administrator's face go pale. Megan stood at a distance, watching them work. One agent held up the Ranger tab, examining it under fluorescent light like it was an artifact from a museum. Bronze metal, worn smooth from handling, engraved with coordinates and a name that hadn't existed officially for 4 years, Red Line 6. Beside it, a stack of commendations in a manila folder. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Combat Action Badge. Certificate she'd never thrown away because some part of her, the part that was still Major Megan O'Brien beneath the scrubs and coffee station conversations, couldn't let them go. The Ranger's 10-year-old daughter had followed her father's transport team into the hospital. She was there when the locker opened, small hand gripping her father's sleeve, watching federal agents catalog her father's savior like an archaeological dig. When the little girl saw the medals, she reached out and touched the Bronze Star with one finger, and her father's hand came down over hers, trembling. He was reading the commendation letter now, the one that had been redacted so heavily it looked like a classified document written in black ink. But federal declassification had lifted some of those redactions. His eyes tracked across words. Major O'Brien's medical interventions under direct fire resulted in 0 preventable combat casualties across a 72-hour operational period. His voice cracked. 0. He said it like a prayer. The crowd in the locker room had grown. Word traveled fast in hospitals. Nurse suspended, federal agents, sealed file. Megan stood motionless, her hands at her sides, her jaw a single controlled line, while her entire hidden existence was catalogued and labeled and turned into evidence. That's when the doors to the locker room opened again and a man in navy dress blues walked through. Commander James Holloway. Call sign Breaker. He'd coordinated with her unit in Helmand, had called in medevacs when she'd needed them, had learned to trust her voice on the radio the way soldiers trust their brothers. He looked directly at the federal agents. I'm claiming operational witness status. That officer's commendations are mine to verify. The agents exchanged glances and nodded. Holloway stepped closer to the open locker and spoke loud enough for the gathering crowd, the nurses, the doctors, the security guards who'd stopped their rounds to watch, to hear every word clearly. Bronze Star with Valor. Awarded for leadership under fire. Silver Star. Awarded for direct life-saving action beyond the call of duty. 2 Purple Hearts. Field promotion to Major after the original unit commander was killed in action. And this, he lifted the Ranger tab like it was made of gold, the 75th Ranger tab. She earned this in places most of you have never heard of, under conditions most of us will thank God we never experience. 2 FBI agents entered the locker room. Not contractors this time but official field personnel with credentials and bearing. One of them held up a folder marked with declassification stamps. We're here to inform Major Megan O'Brien that Operation Silent Guardian, Helmand Province, has been retroactively declassified under executive order. You're being recalled to testimony before the House Armed Services Committee. Your presence is required in Washington, D.C. by next Wednesday. This is not a request. It's a recall notice. The agent's partner was already photographing the commendations, the dog tag, each piece of evidence that Megan O'Brien had existed in another life, in another world, as someone powerful. The ranger's daughter tugged on her father's sleeve and whispered something. He bent down to hear, then looked directly at Megan. His eyes had changed. The gratitude was still there, but now there was recognition. Knowledge. The understanding that the nurse who'd saved his life had done it with 4 years of buried military muscle memory, with training that had been purchased in blood. By 5:51 p.m. that evening, Dr. Richard Ashford sensed the ground shifting beneath him. Board members weren't returning his calls. A hospital attorney had left a message asking him to cease all contact with personnel pending an investigation. The phrase federal involvement had been mentioned 3 times in the past 4 hours. He made a decision that would later be identified as the critical moment of his unraveling. He called his contact at WJX Channel 7, a news anchor he'd cultivated over years of interviews and favorable medical commentary. "I want to go on air tonight," he told her. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding about the suspension. I need the platform to set the record straight before this gets out of control." By 5:30, his makeup was being applied in a television studio. By 6, he was seated across from anchor Diane Morrison, adjusted tie, practiced smile, the confidence of a man who'd never truly faced consequences. Morrison leaned forward with the expression of a professional who smells a story. "Dr. Ashford, you suspended the nurse now identified as Major Megan O'Brien. Some have called you heroic for maintaining standards. Others say you targeted a decorated veteran. How do you respond?" Ashford settled back, composure intact. "Diane, we need to separate emotion from facts here. I had a nurse displaying concerning behavior. Emotional attachment to a patient. Erratic judgment. Unauthorized procedures. Those are fireable offenses regardless of military background. If anything, this proves that military service doesn't translate to civilian competence." She was frankly a disturbed individual playing soldier in a professional environment. The studio phone rang. Morrison's hand went to her earpiece. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming. "We have a caller," she said slowly. "We don't typically accept live calls, but this one is." She paused, her eyes widening. "We have Lieutenant General David Harmon on the line. U.S. Army Special Operations Command." The studio switched to a split screen. A 3-star general appeared, full dress uniform, office in the background marked with the insignia of the highest command levels. Ashford's face drained of color in real time, and Morrison's camera caught every moment of it. General Harmon's voice was calm like a man who'd given orders in combat zones, measured like someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Dr. Ashford, I've been listening to your interview. I want to clarify some facts for your viewers. Major Megan O'Brien is not playing soldier. She's a decorated officer who saved more lives in Helmand Province than your entire hospital will see in a decade. The unauthorized procedure you mentioned? She performed that same needle decompression 17 times in combat, under direct enemy fire, with a 100% survival rate." Morrison leaned forward. "General, can you expand on that?" "I can verify," the general continued, "that Dr. Ashford just slandered a military officer on live television. I can verify that the nurse he called emotionally unstable holds a Bronze Star with valor, earned for direct action under fire. I can verify that her records were classified not because she was incompetent, but because acknowledging her existence would compromise ongoing operations. Major O'Brien honored a direct order to disappear, to live in silence, for 4 years. And apparently that silence didn't protect her from discrimination by a physician who couldn't recognize excellence when it walked into his hospital in scrubs." Ashford's mouth opened and closed silently, a fish dragged onto dry land. The general's voice remained measured, devastating. "You were following your ego, doctor. And now millions of people are watching you learn the consequences." The interview ended. Within 90 minutes, it had 6 million views. By midnight, 14 million. The hashtags trended nationally: Dr. Ashford, Major O'Brien, Sacred Heart scandal. The hospital's phones rang until midnight, when they finally shut off the public line. 6 months later, Meghan walked through Sacred Heart's main entrance wearing navy scrubs, her hair in its military bun, her Ranger tab pinned prominently to her ID badge. Behind the security desk, a man in a guard uniform checked credentials with movement slow and defeated. Dr. Richard Ashford. No stethoscope. No white coat. No authority. Just a man processing visitor badges on minimum wage after the board discovered he'd falsified patient records for years, covering medication errors, burying complaints from nurses who'd questioned his judgment. Meghan passed without acknowledging him, the same politeness she'd show any security guard. But Ashford watched her go, and something collapsed in his face. The recognition that consequences were real. That power had limits. That visibility had defeated him where silence had failed. In the elevator alone, Meghan touched the Ranger tab on her badge and felt something settle in her chest. That afternoon, she stood in front of 30 nursing recruits at a hospital training seminar. She didn't mention Ashford. Didn't dwell on suspension or humiliation. Instead, she talked about what she'd learned in Helmand Province. About trusting your training. About staying calm under pressure. About the difference between authority and leadership. Power is not a title, she told them. Power is the ability to help. The recruits applauded. After the presentation, 3 nurses approached, the ones who'd left the break room when she'd sat down, who'd avoided her during Ashford's campaign. They stammered apologies, ashamed. Meghan listened with the same quiet dignity she'd shown during her worst moments. When they finished, she simply nodded. I understand. Systems teach us to protect ourselves. I'm choosing to teach us something better. That evening, at David's grave, Meghan knelt in the fading light without tears. I kept the promise as long as I could, she told the headstone. But some things are more important than hiding. She stood, brushed dirt from her knees, and walked back to her car. Her reflection in the window showed a woman who'd finally stopped being invisible. If you've ever buried a part of yourself to survive, if you've ever hidden who you really are to play it safe, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments, what would it take for you to step back into the light?